My house in Sacramento is small and simple. One living room, a short hallway, a bedroom, and a sliding glass door that leads out to a fenced backyard. It's the kind of place where you can see almost the entire house from the couch. For 3 years, nothing unusual ever happened there. I had neighbors on both sides. Kids rode bikes down the street during the day. At night, the whole block usually went quiet by 10 or 11. Because of that, I got comfortable. Comfortable enough that I stopped thinking about how predictable my life probably looked from the outside. That's something I didn't understand until the night I woke up around 2 in the morning, walked into my living room, and realized someone was already sitting there. My evenings usually follow the same pattern. I get home around 6 or 7, depending on the day, make something simple for dinner, shower, and watch television in the living room until I'm ready for bed. My couch faces the TV, and the sliding door behind it leads to the backyard. When the lights are off, the glass acts like a mirror and reflects the room back at you. In September of 2021, I started noticing small things outside that I brushed off. One night, my trash bin had tipped over beside the side gate. I assumed raccoons or wind. Another night, the motion light near the patio flicked on while I was washing dishes. When I looked out the window, I didn't see anyone in the yard. None of that felt unusual enough to worry about. The neighborhood is quiet but not isolated. There are houses on both sides of me and people walk dogs in the evenings. It didn't feel like the kind of place where someone would be paying attention to my house specifically. Looking back, there were probably more signs than I recognized at the time. My side gate latch was loose one afternoon when I came home from the work. I remember adjusting it and thinking maybe I had left it that way while taking the trash out earlier in the week. Another night, the motion light came on again, and when I stepped outside to look, the backyard was empty. I didn't install cameras. I didn't call anyone. At that stage, it felt like background noise. The night that changed everything started the same as most others. I had worked late and didn't get home until around 8:30. I heated up leftovers, watched half of a show I'd already seen before, and texted a coworker about a case we were both involved in. Around 11, I turned everything off and went to bed. My bedroom is down a short hallway from the living room. When I shut my bedroom door at night, the rest of the house goes dark except for the faint glow from the microwave clock in the kitchen. I fell asleep quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't wake up to a loud noise. It was the kind of waking where your body shifts from sleep to awareness without a clear reason. At first, I thought I needed water. My room was dark, and for a moment I stayed still, letting my eyes adjust. The house was quiet in the normal nighttime way. The refrigerator humming faintly, air moving through the vents. I got out of bed and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. The living room sits between the hallway and the kitchen. Normally, when I step out of the bedroom at night, the living room is completely dark. That night, it wasn't. The porch light from the backyard was on, and a dim orange glow from it spilled through the sliding glass door and across the living room floor. As I stepped into the room, my eyes caught a shape on the couch. At first, my brain treated it like a pile of blankets or something I had left out earlier. Then the shape shifted slightly. There was a man sitting on my couch. He was leaning forward slightly with his elbows resting on his knees. His hands were together, fingers interlaced. He was wearing gloves. For a second, neither of us moved. My mind tried to assemble explanations faster than I could process them. Someone from maintenance, someone who came in the wrong house, a friend who had the wrong address. None of those explanation survived the first few seconds. He was already inside my house. He didn't say anything. He didn't stand up or reach toward me. He just looked at me from where he was sitting. I couldn't see his face clearly because the light behind him was stronger than the light in the room. His features were mostly shadow. I realized I was standing in the hallway entrance, about 12 feet away from him. My phone was on the kitchen counter behind him. I asked what he was doing in my house. The man didn't answer. He tilted his head slightly like he was studying me. The silence made the moment stretch longer than it should have. I took a step backward. My heart was beating fast, but my legs still worked. I told him to get out. Still nothing. For a moment I wondered if he was waiting for me to move closer. That thought broke the paralysis. I screamed. The sound surprised even me. It was loud and raw and filled the room instantly. The man stood up at the same moment. He moved quickly, faster than I expected from someone who had been sitting so still. Instead of coming toward me, he turned and ran straight for the sliding glass door. The door was already unlocked. He pulled it open in one smooth motion and stepped out onto the patio. By the time I reached the kitchen counter to grab my phone, he was already crossing the yard. The motion light clicked on again, flooding the backyard with white light. I saw him reach the side gate, lift the latch, and disappear into the darkness beyond the fence. My hands were shaking slightly as I dialed 911. The operator kept asking me to slow down and repeat my address. I locked myself in the bedroom while I waited for officers to arrive. The house felt different immediately. Every small sound from the vents or pipes seemed louder. When the police arrived, they cleared the house room by room. One of them checked the backyard while the other spoke with me in the living room. The couch still had the slight indentation where the man had been sitting. The officer asked if I had left the door unlocked tonight. I told him I thought so, that I usually locked it before bed, but that night I couldn't remember doing it. They examined the sliding door and the back gate and noted there was no forced entry. They asked about spare keys, contractors, or anyone who might know my schedule. I told them no. One of the officers walked through my backyard again with a flashlight. When he came back, he asked how long I'd lived in the house. I told him 3 years. He noted that I kept a pretty consistent routine and asked if the lights were on around the same time every night. I told him they were. He looked toward the sliding glass door and the patio beyond it and told me that from the yard you can see straight into this room when the lights are on. I hadn't thought about that before. He didn't say much else after that, but I understood what he meant. Whoever that man was, he probably didn't choose my house at random. He had been watching long enough to know when I would be asleep, long enough to know the layout, long enough to sit down on my couch and wait without feeling rushed. I didn't sleep in the house that night. My friend Sarah picked me up, and I stayed with her for the rest of the week while I had the locks changed and cameras installed. I still live there, but sometimes when I walk into the living room late at night, I glance at the couch before turning on the lights. There's something about renting an older place that makes you accept a certain level of weirdness. You tell yourself it's part of the deal. The floors creak, the heat kicks on, and the ducts pop. The plumbing has moods. You learn which doors stick in winter and which windows rattle when it's windy. After a while, those sounds stop being signals, that they just become background. That's how it was for me when I moved into that house in Pittsburgh. I was 28 and in grad school. I needed a place that was cheap enough to make sense on a stipend, close enough to campus that I wasn't burning money on parking, and quiet enough that I could actually write. The house was an older duplex-style rental on a street with a lot of similar places. Narrow lots, small porches, a row of trash bins out back. It wasn't charming exactly, it was functional. 2 floors, narrow stairs, a kitchen that always smelled faintly of old wood no matter how much I cleaned, and an unfinished basement that looked like every basement I'd seen in Pittsburgh. Concrete floor, exposed beams, furnace and water heater against the far wall, a washer and dryer near the bottom of the steps. I didn't love the basement, but I didn't need to love it. I only went down there for laundry and to store a couple of boxes I didn't want in my bedroom. When I first moved in, my landlord did the standard walkthrough. He was middle-aged, friendly in a tired way, and clearly managed a lot of properties. He showed me where the shut-off valves were, how the thermostat worked, and where the breaker panel was. At the basement door, he mentioned it was unfinished but dry and told me to just keep stuff off the floor if we got a big storm. I remember asking if the basement was secure. He nodded, like he'd heard the question 100 times, and said the windows were small and there was nothing to worry about. He handed me the keys and left. That was that. For the first month, nothing stood out. My schedule was boring in a way I liked. Classes during the day, research meetings, then long evenings at home reading and writing. I'd make dinner, wash dishes, and settle into a routine where my body could finally stop reacting to other people. I'm not someone who jumps at every sound. I grew up in a house with 3 siblings and thin walls. Noise doesn't automatically mean danger to me. It means life. So when I heard the first sound from the basement, I didn't even get up. It was late, and I was upstairs at my desk. The house was quiet except for the furnace cycling and the occasional car passing outside. I had been staring at my laptop for too long, reworking the same paragraph. I paused, leaned back, and that's when I noticed a dull thump from below. Not a bang, not something breaking, more like a heavy object shifting. I waited for it to repeat. Nothing. I went back to writing. A few nights later, I heard something again. This one was softer, more like a scrape. It went for a second or two and stopped. I muted my laptop and listened, sitting still in my desk chair. Silence. I told myself it was probably the pipes or the furnace. The house was old, the basement was unfinished, and sound carries in odd ways through exposed beams and ductwork. I didn't think about it after that, not in a way that changed anything, but over the next couple of weeks, I heard variations of it often enough that I started noticing a pattern without meaning to. It wasn't constant, it wasn't every night. It came in short bursts, one thump, one scrape, then nothing. It also seemed to happen when I was upstairs and quiet. If I was running the sink or watching TV or on the phone, I didn't notice it at all. It was only in those late-night stretches when I was working in silence. That made it easier to dismiss. If it was only when the house was quiet, that meant it was probably always happening, and I just wasn't hearing it until everything else stopped. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to do laundry and check the basement more thoroughly while it was still light outside. The basement stairs were steep and narrow. The light switch was at the bottom, which meant you always took the first few steps in darkness. I hated that, but it was normal for older houses. When I reached the bottom and turned the light on, the basement looked exactly the way it always did. Concrete floor, the furnace humming, the washer lid closed. I walked around slowly looking for anything obvious. Water, a broken window, signs of animals. I didn't see anything. There were a couple of basement windows, small ones near the ceiling. They were the type with metal frames and a latch that always looked flimsy even when it was working. I couldn't reach them easily without climbing onto something, so I didn't inspect them closely that day. I went back upstairs and told myself I had satisfied the part of my brain that wanted an explanation. The noises continued, but I filed them away as old house stuff and moved on. It took something small and honestly boring to shift my attention. I went down one evening to move a box so I could reach the detergent. One of the boxes on the shelf near the furnace was not where I remembered leaving it. It was pushed farther back, angled slightly, like someone had nudged it and not put it back. I stared at it longer than I needed to, then told myself I probably moved it the last time I did laundry and forgot. I was tired. My sleep had been weird. I'd been living in a cycle of reading, writing, and half resting. I adjusted the box and continued what I came down for. A few days later, I noticed the same box again. It wasn't drastically different, just slightly off. Enough that I registered it twice. This time I felt annoyed with myself, like my memory was sloppy, and I didn't like that. I don't enjoy the feeling of not being able to trust my own routines. That night I started paying attention in a new way, not panicked, just tracking. When I went into the basement, I looked at the shelves, I looked at the floor, I looked at the spaces behind the furnace and water heater that I never bothered to look at because they were unpleasant and dusty. Nothing obvious. I went back upstairs. Over the next week, I started noticing small details I hadn't cared about before. The basement door didn't always latch cleanly unless you pulled it shut firmly. The air in the basement smelled slightly different depending on the day. Sometimes it was damp concrete. Sometimes it was dust. Once, it smelled faintly of food, but I wrote that off as something in the trash upstairs. One evening, the motion sensor light in the shared back area behind the duplex came on while I was cooking. I looked out the kitchen window and saw nothing. That happens sometimes. It wasn't unusual enough to connect to anything, and still the feeling of something is slightly off started creeping into my daily decisions. I began doing small tests without announcing them to myself as tests. I placed a bottle of detergent on the washer in a specific position, label facing outward. I placed a cardboard box on the shelf with the tape seam lined up with a beam overhead. It wasn't obsessive. It was just enough that I would know if something changed. The next time I went down, the detergent bottle was turned, not tipped over, not spilled, just rotated. I stared at it and tried to replay my last laundry trip. Had I turned it? Would I have turned it? I didn't have an answer. It bothered me because it wasn't dramatic enough to force certainty. After that, I made a point of taking my phone into the basement with me every time. Not because I wanted to film me anything, it just felt wrong to be down there without a way to call someone. I still didn't have a clear story in my head. Animals could move things. Rodents get into boxes. A raccoon could get in through a window and drag something, though I didn't know how it would get out again. Pipes could thump. Ducts could scrape. All of those explanations were available, and I wanted one of them to be true. In February, the weather got colder. The house ran heat more often. The nights were long and quiet. One night I was upstairs reading on the couch when I heard a sound from below that didn't match the others. It was soft, but it sounded like fabric moving across concrete. Not a pop, not a metallic ping, not a thump. It went for a second, paused, then went again. I muted the TV and sat still. It stopped. I waited, staring at the basement door at the end of the hall like it might do something. Nothing happened. I should have left it there. I should have stayed upstairs and told myself it was nothing again. Instead, I stood up and walked to the basement door. I stood there with my hand on the knob for a moment. I didn't like the idea of going down. Not because I believed something was there, but because I didn't want to prove myself wrong either way. I opened the door and started down the stairs. The first few steps were dark, and I moved slowly, one hand on the railing. When I reached the bottom, I turned on the light. Everything looked normal. That almost made it worse, because it meant I was going to have to decide whether I was imagining things. I walked toward the washer and dryer first, then toward the shelves. I looked at the box I'd been tracking. It was slightly angled again. I felt irritated, like someone was making a point in a language I didn't want to understand. I walked toward the furnace. Behind the furnace and water heater, there was a narrow space between the wall and the equipment where the light didn't reach well. I hadn't explored it before because it was awkward and because it felt like a space you didn't need to enter unless something was wrong with the furnace. I stepped closer. At first, I just saw shadows. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw a blanket on the floor. Not a small rag, a real blanket, spread out like someone had been lying on it. Next to it were 2 food wrappers and a plastic bottle. There was also a small pile of something that looked like clothing, folded in a rough way. The basement air felt colder against my face, like I'd stepped into a different room. I didn't move closer to inspect it. I didn't touch anything. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on that corner. The most unnerving part wasn't the blanket. It was how tucked away it was, like someone knew exactly how to use the basement's layout to stay unseen. I walked back to the stairs and went up quickly, not running but not taking my time either. When I reached the top, I shut the basement door and locked it. Then I stood in the kitchen with my phone in my hand and tried to decide what to do next. I thought about calling my landlord first. Then I thought about the fact that if someone was in the basement, I didn't want to announce anything to them through the floor. I didn't want to shout. I didn't want to pace. I didn't want to make noise that could be interpreted as panic. I stepped into the living room, kept the phone close to my body, and called 911 in a low voice. The operator asked where I was. I gave my address. She asked what was happening. I told her I found signs someone might be in my basement. She asked if I'd seen the person. I told her no, but that there were blankets and food wrappers and it looked like someone had been down there. She told me to stay upstairs, keep doors locked, and wait for officers. I sat on the couch facing the front door, and not because I thought the person would come through it, but because it gave me something to watch. The basement door was behind me down the hall, out of view, and that bothered me. I moved a chair from the kitchen and positioned it so I could see the hallway. The minutes felt long. I kept hearing normal house sounds and assigning them more meaning than they deserved. The furnace turning on, the refrigerator cycling, a neighbor's car door closing outside. At one point, I heard a faint sound from below, like a small bump. I didn't move. I didn't want to give the basement any information about what I was doing. When the police arrived, they knocked on the front door and announced themselves. I opened it immediately and stepped back, letting them come in. 2 officers entered and asked me to stay near the front while they checked the basement. One of them asked if I had any weapons in the house. I said no. He asked if I had any pets. I said no. They moved toward the basement door. I stood in the living room listening to their footsteps on the stairs. I didn't hear anything from below. After a few minutes, one officer came back upstairs and said they didn't see anyone down there. I didn't feel relief the way I expected. My brain immediately went to the thought that if they weren't down there now, where were they? The other officer came upstairs and said they found what I described: blankets, wrappers, a bottle. He asked if any of it belonged to me. I told him no. They asked if anyone else lived in the building. I told them it was a duplex. They asked if I knew the neighbors well. I said we nodded in passing but didn't socialize. They went back down to inspect the basement windows. When they returned, one of them told me there was a small window on the side of the basement, partially hidden behind bushes outside. The latch was loose enough that it could be pushed open. He said the frame shifted when he applied pressure. He also mentioned that it looked like it had been used more than once. They took photos and collected the wrappers. They told me to contact my landlord immediately and have the window secured. They also suggested I stay somewhere else for the night. I didn't argue. I packed a bag quickly, laptop, charger, a couple of changes of clothes. I didn't go back down to the basement. I didn't even open that door again. I left the house with the officers still there and drove to a friend's apartment closer to campus. The next day, my landlord came by with a contractor. He sounded surprised on the phone, and he sounded concerned. He also sounded slightly irritated, like this was going to cost him money. They replaced the window latch and reinforced the frame. They added a better lock on the basement door. The contractor said the bushes outside had grown enough over the years that you wouldn't notice someone crouched there from the street. The police followed up once, asking if anything else had been disturbed in the house. I checked closets and cabinets. Nothing was missing. Nothing looked rummaged through upstairs. That detail did not comfort me. It made the situation more specific. Whoever had been down there didn't need my belongings. They needed the space. I finished out the lease because moving mid-semester is hard, but I didn't use the basement again unless I absolutely had to. I started doing laundry at a friend's place. I kept a chair propped under the basement doorknob at night. Not because it was a perfect solution, but because it made the door harder to open quietly. I kept the upstairs lights on longer than I used to. I stopped wearing headphones when I studied. By the time the lease ended, moving out felt less like an upgrade and more like a task I had been waiting to complete. On the last day, I carried the final box to my car and stood in the empty living room for a moment, keys in my hand, looking down the hallway where the basement door sat. I locked the front door behind me as I left, and I didn't look back at the house once I reached the street. When you are responsible for a house and a kid, you act like you're the final layer between normal life and whatever is outside it. You lock doors without thinking, you check the garage twice, and you take the trash out and you look up and down the street, even when there's no reason to. You do it because it's your job, even if no one called it that. I've always been that way with my daughter, Lily. Not paranoid, just steady. If something breaks, I fix it. If something seems off, I look for a practical reason first. That's why I didn't take her seriously the first time she told me someone was standing near the trees. This happened in Spokane in September of 2019. Lily was 9. We lived in a normal neighborhood on the edge of the city, where the backyards back up to a strip of trees before it turns into a bigger green belt. In the daytime, it's a nice feature. Birds, shade, the feeling that you've got some space behind you. At night, it's just a dark line that starts at the end of your grass. I'm a mechanic. I worked at a shop across town. Most nights I'd get home around 6, wash up, eat dinner with Lily, help her with homework, and then we'd do the usual evening stuff, showers, a little TV, bed. Her mom and I were already separated by then. Lily stayed with me most weekdays because it was closer to her school. It was a routine that worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable, and predictable is a lot when you're trying to keep a kid grounded. The first time she mentioned it, it was a Tuesday night. We'd finished dinner and she was doing something on the living room floor, coloring or building something with those little plastic bricks. I was at the kitchen counter sorting through mail when she said casually, "Dad, there's a man by the trees." I didn't look up right away. My first thought was that she meant a neighbor walking a dog behind the fence line or someone cutting through the green belt. I asked her what she meant. She pointed toward the back sliding door and said he was back there by the trees. I walked over and looked out. The yard was dark except for the porch light. Our fence was a standard wooden privacy fence about 6 feet high. Beyond it, you could see the top edges of trees and deeper darkness behind them. I didn't see anyone. No movement, no flashlight, no phone glow. Nothing. I told her I didn't see anybody. She shrugged like she didn't care if I believed her and said he was there a second ago. I told her that could have been a shadow or one of the neighbors, but she insisted he was standing still. Lily watched my face like she was trying to see if I was lying to make her feel better. She said okay, but she didn't sound convinced. That night after she went to bed, I checked the locks again. Front door, back door, windows. I did it quickly without drama and told myself I was being responsible. The next day at work, I mentioned it to a guy I trusted, partly as a joke. I told him my kid thought there was a guy in the trees behind our house. He laughed and said, "That's how you know she has an imagination." That's what I wanted it to be. Then Friday night happened. Lily was in the living room in pajamas, hair still damp from her shower, and I was folding laundry on the couch. She was watching something on the TV at low volume. Everything felt normal. She muted the TV and said he was there. I looked up and asked where. She pointed with the same exact motion as before, steady and specific. I stood and went to the sliding door. I turned off the living room lamp so the reflection in the glass wouldn't block my view. Then I pressed my face closer to the window. At first, I saw nothing. Then I noticed a shape at the far edge of the yard, beyond the fence line, where the trees began. It wasn't on my property. It was farther back, near where the brush thickened. It looked like someone standing still between the trunks. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see clothes clearly. I could just see that it wasn't a tree, and it wasn't moving the way branches move. My first thought was that it could be a neighbor, someone walking through the green belt, or a teenager being dumb. I slid the door open and stepped out onto the patio again. The shape didn't move. I took 2 steps into the yard and shouted, "Hey!" The shape shifted slightly, then disappeared deeper into the trees. I stood there for a moment, waiting for the sound of someone running away or crashing through brush. I didn't hear anything. That bothered me more than if I'd heard obvious footsteps. I went back inside, closed and locked the sliding door and pulled the curtains. Lily was watching me closely again. She noted that I saw him. I told her I saw something. She didn't argue. She looked relieved in a way that made me feel guilty, like she'd been carrying it alone, and now it was shared. I tried to keep the rest of the evening normal. We finished laundry. I made her a snack. We read for a bit, then bedtime. After she was asleep, I walked through the house again, checking locks. I also checked the backyard motion light. It worked. I stood there waving my arms, watching it trigger and shut off. I told myself that if someone was behind the trees, the light wouldn't reach them anyway, but at least I'd know if they crossed into the yard. The next morning, I went outside to take the trash to the curb. The grass was wet with dew. As I walked toward the side gate, I noticed something in the lawn near the fence, in the area that stays a little softer because the sprinklers hit it more. Footprints. Not a clear boot tread, but the shape of soles pressed into the grass. Several of them. They were facing the house. That detail made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't like because it wasn't an accident. People don't leave footprints facing your windows unless they stand there looking. I followed them slowly, step by step. trying not to smear them. They led to a spot near the corner of the yard where you could see directly into the living room through the sliding door if the curtains were open. It was also the spot where Lily usually sat on the floor watching TV. The prints stopped there, like someone had stood still for a while. Then they backed away, lighter marks in the grass, and disappeared near the fence line. I checked the fence boards. No broken sections, no fresh splinters, no obvious signs of someone climbing over from my side. That didn't mean they hadn't. A person can get over a fence without leaving dramatic evidence if they're careful. I took pictures with my phone from a few angles, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. Then I called the non-emergency police line. I explained that Lily had been seeing someone near the trees, and I now had footprints in my backyard facing the house. I told them I wasn't claiming someone had broken in. I just wanted to report it and ask for advice. A patrol officer came later that afternoon. He walked the yard with me and looked at the photos. The prints were less visible by then because the sun had dried the grass and I'd inevitably walked around the area. He didn't act dismissive, but he didn't act alarmed either. He said it could be kids or someone cutting through the green belt. I asked him if they'd be standing in my yard. He noted that some people don't have boundaries. He asked if I had cameras, and I said no. He suggested motion cameras and brighter lighting, and he said they could have a unit swing through the area at night for a few days. He told me he couldn't promise they'd catch someone and that if they weren't there when they passed, they wouldn't see anything. I told him I got it. After he left, I went to a hardware store and bought what I could afford without turning it into a full project. A basic motion camera for the backyard, a stronger bulb for the porch light, and a cheap door alarm for the sliding door that would beep if it opened. That night, I installed everything. It wasn't perfect. The camera's field of view didn't cover the entire fence line, and the motion sensor picked up our dog sometimes when he walked along the yard. But it was something. Lily watched me install the door alarm and asked what it was. I told her it was just extra so we know if the door opens. She asked if it was because of the man. I told her it was because I wanted to know if anything opened. She nodded and didn't press. Over the next 2 nights, the motion camera sent a couple of alerts. One was our dog, one was a cat, and one was the wind moving branches enough to trigger motion. No clear person. The patrol car did drive through once that I saw, slow headlights along the street. That made me feel like someone else knew what was happening, which helped more than it should have. Then came the night that pushed it past someone is watching into something else. It was midweek. Lily had school the next day. We did the normal evening routine: dinner, homework, showers, bedtime. I stayed up later than usual watching TV quietly, mostly because I didn't feel like lying in bed staring at the ceiling. My mind kept drifting toward the backyard and the fence line. Before going to bed, I checked the locks again. I made sure the door alarm was set. I checked the camera app. Battery okay? Connection okay? I went to bed around midnight. I woke up because the dog was making a low, continuous sound near the bedroom door. Not barking, more like a tense whine that he does when someone is at the front door. I sat up and listened. The house was quiet. The dog stayed in place, ears up. I got out of bed and stepped into the hallway. From the hallway, I could see the faint glow from the living room where the street light outside hits the curtains. Everything looked still. I walked toward Lily's room first. I didn't want to move around the house without making sure she was okay. Her door was closed. I opened it quietly and looked in. She was asleep. I left the door cracked and went back toward the living room. That's when I heard it. A soft sound from the back of the house. Not the alarm beep, not a crash, a sound like the sliding door moving against its frame. It was subtle enough that if I hadn't already been listening, I might have missed it. I stopped walking. Then I heard another sound. A small change in pressure, like a door that's almost shut being eased open. I stepped into the kitchen and looked toward the sliding door. The curtains were drawn, but there was a narrow gap where they didn't meet perfectly. Through that gap, I could see the door handle area. The handle was moving, not jerking around, being tested. The door alarm didn't beep yet, which meant the door hadn't opened enough to separate the sensor. I stood there with my phone in my hand and my other hand on the kitchen counter, trying to decide whether to turn on lights or stay dark. I didn't want to open the curtains. I didn't want to announce exactly where I was. The handle moved again, and then the door shifted. The alarm chirped once, just a single beep. The first warning sound, the kind that makes your brain jump even when you expect it. The sliding door opened a few inches. The curtains moved with it, the gap widening, and I could see the dark outline of the yard beyond. I could also see a hand at the edge of the glass, fingers curled around the frame. That was enough. I backed up quietly, moving toward the hallway. I didn't shout and I didn't run. I moved like I didn't want to make a sound that would tell someone where I was standing. I went to Lily's room first and closed the door fully behind me. Then I woke her with my hand on her shoulder. I told her to get up, put her shoes on, and stay quiet. Her face changed immediately, not panic but recognition. Like she'd been waiting for me to believe her for real, I grabbed my phone and called 911 from her room. I kept my voice low and told the operator someone was opening my back door. I gave my address and told them my daughter was in the house. The operator told me officers were on the way and asked if I could see the person. I told her I wasn't going back out there. While I was still on the call, I heard the sliding door alarm beep again. Faster this time, meaning the door had opened farther. Then the beeping stopped. Not because it reset. Because it was switched off. I knew that because the alarm had a small toggle on the side. You have to reach it to silence it. Lily looked at me wide-eyed. I put my finger to my lips without thinking. We stayed still. I didn't hear footsteps in the house. I didn't hear drawers opening. I didn't hear anything that sounded like someone moving through the living room. That silence was almost worse because it left room for too many possibilities. I heard the back door slide again, quieter, like someone easing it back toward closed. Then nothing. The operator kept me talking, asking where we were, telling me to stay put. A few minutes later, I saw red and blue lights flashing through Lily's curtains. The officers knocked and announced themselves. I opened the front door and stepped out with Lily behind me. 2 officers entered and cleared the house, while another stayed with us on the porch. They checked the sliding door. It was closed. It was locked. The officer came back and asked me to show him the door alarm. I walked him to the sliding door and pointed to where it was mounted. The sensor was still stuck to the frame. The toggle was in the off position. I told him that wasn't like that earlier. He nodded and wrote something down. They checked the yard with flashlights, walked along the fence line, and checked the gate latch. They didn't find anyone. They didn't find a crowbar or a tool. One officer told me it could have been someone testing doors, and when the alarm went off, they left. I didn't argue with him. I didn't have a better explanation that would sound reasonable, but I knew someone had been close enough to reached through a cracked opening and flipped that alarm switch. That wasn't a raccoon or the wind. That was a person. The officers asked if we had somewhere else to go for the night. I called my sister and she told us to come over immediately. Before we left, I walked through the house quickly and checked rooms. Nothing appeared missing. No drawers dumped out, no obvious mess. That didn't help. It just meant the point wasn't stealing. We spent the night at my sister's place. Lily slept on a couch in her living room with my sister's kids in the next room. I stayed awake longer than I should have, listening to normal house sounds that belonged to other people's lives. The next day I bought better cameras. I upgraded the locks, added a bar to the sliding door track, and trimmed back bushes near the fence. I asked a neighbor if their camera system pointed anywhere near my backyard. A few days later, a different officer followed up. He said they'd increased patrols again. He also said carefully that unless someone was caught in the act, there wasn't much more they could do. After that week, Lily stopped mentioning the man by the trees. Not because everything felt safe again. More like she didn't trust that telling me would change anything now. This happened in Albuquerque in January of 2023. I was 26, living alone in a small apartment complex on the edge of the city. My unit was on the second floor at the end of the walkway. My schedule at the hospital was mostly nights at that point. 3 shifts a week, sometimes more if we were short. On my off days, I'd try to reset my sleep, but it never worked fully. I was usually tired in a steady way. The first time I noticed the bedroom door, it didn't feel significant. I woke up after a shift. The bedroom door was open a few inches. I stared at it, trying to remember if I had closed it. I told myself I must not have latched it properly. Sometimes the door would bounce slightly if you didn't pull it all the way. The HVAC could create a little pressure change in the apartment, and interior doors in old buildings can drift. I got up, closed it fully, and went back to bed. The second time I noticed it was in the morning after a day off. I remember brushing my teeth, locking the front door, and closing the bedroom door like I always did. When I woke up, it was open again. Not wide open, just that same small gap. I stood there in the doorway in my pajamas, staring at it like it was a trick. Then I checked the simplest explanation first. I opened and closed it several times to see if the latch was loose. It clicked shut every time. I pushed gently on it to see if it would drift open. It didn't. I told myself maybe I was the one drifting through my own routine. Maybe I was closing it halfway in my sleep-deprived state and imagining the click. Maybe I was waking up and moving it without fully remembering. A few days later, it happened again. This time I came home after a night shift. I remember pulling the door until it clicked. I remember it because I made myself notice it. When I woke up, the door was open. The gap looked slightly wider than before. I got up and walked to the front door and checked the locks. Still locked, chain still in place. No signs anyone had been inside. I checked the windows, closed and locked. I checked the balcony door, locked. I stood in the kitchen and tried to explain it to myself again. I decided to test it. That afternoon, before leaving for another shift, I took a photo of my bedroom door after I closed it. The photo showed the door flush with the frame. No gap. When I came home the next morning and stepped into the bedroom, I saw it immediately. The door was open again. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photo. The door had been closed when I left. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling my focus narrow onto that gap. Then I walked through the apartment and looked at everything else. Nothing obvious was missing, but a small detail caught my eye. The bedside table drawer was slightly more open than I usually left it, not pulled out like someone had rummaged, just cracked the way it looks when you didn't push it all the way in. I pushed it closed and stood there. It didn't prove anything, but it made the problem feel less abstract. That day, I bought a cheap door wedge and a small battery alarm. I put the wedge beside the bedroom door and set the alarm on the inside of the door frame. I tested it. It worked. That night, I went to bed knowing that if the door moved, I'd hear it. The first night with the alarm, nothing happened. I woke up with the door closed and the wedge still in place. For a moment, I felt embarrassed, like I'd overreacted. Then the next night happened. It was one of my days off. I went to bed around midnight. I did my routine, closed the bedroom door, slid the wedge into place, and checked that the alarm was set. I lay there for a while, not sleeping. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up because the alarm beeped. It was a sharp, repeated beep, loud enough to snap me awake instantly. The bedroom door was open several inches. The wedge had been pushed out of the way. It was lying on its side on the carpet. The alarm was still beeping. For a second, I couldn't understand how the wedge could move unless the door opened against it with enough force to push it aside. Then I saw the hallway beyond the door. A person was standing there facing into my room. They weren't rushing toward me. They weren't speaking. They were just there, looking. I sat up quickly and grabbed my phone. The person shifted backward and moved out of view. The alarm was still beeping. I got out of bed and moved to the door, but I didn't step into the hallway. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were clumsy, but I managed to call 911. While the phone rang, I pushed the wedge back into place and turned the alarm off. I told the operator someone had been in my apartment hallway, looking into my bedroom. She told me to stay in my room with the door locked until officers arrived. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened for movement. I could hear my own breathing and the building settling, but I couldn't hear footsteps. When the police arrived, they knocked and announced themselves. I confirmed through the peephole that they were uniformed. They entered and swept the apartment. They checked the front door, no damage. They checked the windows and balcony door, locked. They asked if I had left my door unlocked earlier in the night. I told them I hadn't. They asked if anyone else had keys. I said no. They looked at the bedroom door wedge on the floor and the alarm device. One officer asked me to demonstrate how I set it. I showed him. He tested it and said it worked. He asked if I actually saw the person. I told him I had in the hallway. They took a report and suggested changing locks. I didn't sleep after they left. The next morning, I called the leasing office. They offered to rekey the lock for a fee. I paid it immediately. I also bought a second door wedge, a stronger one, and a small camera that pointed at the front door from inside. For a while after that, I slept with the bedroom door locked and the wedge in place. I didn't get another clear sighting after that night, but the door never stopped being part of my routine. It went from being a sleep habit to being something I checked, like it mattered. And if I woke up and saw light in that gap, even after the locks were changed, I stopped assuming airflow was the reason. There are certain parts of a house most people don't think about very often. For me, that place was the attic. The house I rented in Albany had one of those small ceiling hatches in the hallway. When I first moved in, the landlord showed it to me. He told me I probably wouldn't ever need to go up there as it was just insulation and ductwork. That was fine with me. I had no interest in climbing into a dusty attic in the middle of winter. Most days, I barely noticed the hatch. I moved into that house in late October of 2022. By December, the routine of living there felt settled. I worked as an accountant for a small firm downtown. It was quiet living alone, but not in a bad way. The first time I noticed the attic door was slightly open, I assumed I had simply missed it before. The panel wasn't sitting perfectly flush with the ceiling. One corner had dropped maybe half an inch. I stood there for a moment staring at it. Then I reached up, pressed the panel, and it slid back into place with a soft click. I figured it had shifted with the change in temperature. I didn't think about it again. A few days later, I came home from work and saw it again. Same corner, same small gap. This time I stood beneath it longer. I pushed it shut again. The latch caught. About a week later, I noticed it again when I was heading to bed. I sighed and reached up to push it closed for the third time. This time I jiggled the panel a little to make sure it was secure. It held. I went to bed thinking the hinge probably needed tightening. But over the next 2 weeks, the same thing kept happening. Not every day, just often enough that it started to bother me. I would close it before work. When I came home, it would be open slightly again. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to be a hinge issue. At that point, I stopped thinking about hinges and started thinking about gravity. One Saturday afternoon, I grabbed a small stepladder and climbed up to look at it more closely. When I pressed on the panel, it swung downward easily. A wooden ladder, folded down from inside the hatch. I hadn't realized the attic access had a ladder attached. Dust fell from the opening as the ladder extended. I stood there staring into the dark space above. The attic smelled like insulation and cold air. I didn't climb up. Instead, I looked around the opening from the ladder and checked the latch mechanism. It looked simple, a metal clasp that caught when the panel shut. Nothing obviously broken. I pushed the ladder back up carefully and closed the hatch. For a few days after that, the attic door stayed closed. Then one night I heard something. It was late, probably around midnight. I was sitting on the couch, working through some paperwork when I heard a faint sound above the ceiling. A slow, shifting noise, almost like someone adjusting their weight on a wooden surface. I muted the TV and listened. The sound stopped. I stayed still for a while, waiting to see if it would happen again. Nothing. My first thought was animals. I stood up and walked into the hallway. The attic hatch was closed. Everything looked normal. The next night it happened again. This time the sound lasted longer. A soft, dragging noise followed by a faint creak. Something heavier. I stepped into the hallway again and looked up. The attic hatch was slightly open. That same corner. My chest felt tight. Animals don't open attic hatches. I stood there listening. The noise above stopped. I went back into the living room and grabbed my phone. I thought about calling the landlord right then, but it was late, and I didn't want to overreact. Instead, I decided I would check it again in the morning. That night, I locked my bedroom door before going to sleep. The next morning, the attic hatch was open wider than I had ever seen it, enough that I could see a thin line of darkness between the panel and the ceiling. I stood there with my coffee in my hand, staring at it. I didn't climb the ladder. Instead, I stepped outside and called the police. I told the dispatcher I believed someone might be in my attic. 2 officers arrived about 15 minutes later. They walked through the house first. Then one of them positioned himself beneath the attic hatch and pulled the ladder down. Dust fell again as the ladder extended. The officer climbed slowly, flashlight in one hand. The second officer stayed below, For several seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard the officer's voice from the attic telling me they had someone up there. The words made my stomach drop. They ordered the person to come down. A few moments later, a man climbed down the ladder. He looked dirty and thin, wearing layers of clothing that were covered in insulation fibers. The officers guided him out of the house and into the patrol car. Later, they explained what they found up there. The attic had a narrow crawl space that ran above the hallway and part of the living room. In one section, the insulation had been pushed aside to create a small area where someone could lie down. There were blankets, food wrappers, and empty water bottles. One officer told me the man likely entered through the roof above the detached garage behind the house. I moved out a month later, not because the house was unsafe anymore, but because every time I walked down that hallway, I looked up at the ceiling. Tonight's stories all had one thing in common. Someone learned the house first. If that detail unsettled you, smash that like button, hit subscribe so you never miss the next nightmare, and tell me which warning sign you would have caught earlier. And if you think the safest place after something like that is getting in the car and leaving, you might want to see this next video. Click now to watch 4 disturbing late-night drive horror stories, because the highway can feel just as empty and just as dangerous. Thanks for watching. Stay alert to stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare. And hey, before you go grab a flashlight for a quick attic check, why not hit like and subscribe? It's a lot less scary than a surprise roommate, and I promise to only haunt your notification bell.